Hi, I'm Nick Schulz, the editor of American.com, and welcome to an episode of American Conversations. Our guest today is Professor P.J. Hill. Professor Hill is a professor of economics at Wheaton College in Illinois. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, you are here at AEI to give a lecture this evening about morality and capitalism at a time when many are denouncing the alleged greed that got us into the current financial mess and broader economic mess. And I want to return to this idea in a minute. But first, I'd like to talk to you about some of your earlier work that I've certainly come to know over the years. You spent a lot of your time as an economist analyzing the intersection of market activity and the environment, particularly as it relates to property rights. One thing I want to know and draw out from you a little bit is how has morality or a moral view of the universe informed your belief about markets, property, and the environment?
I would start with the idea that property rights really have to be rooted in some sorts of a moral grounding. You have to have some idea who's going to own what. And my conception of the individual as a person of dignity and worth, from a Christian perspective, that's the Imago Dei. From other perspectives, there's other ways of grounding that. But the idea of self-ownership or the idea of owning property has to be grounded in some conception of who the person is. And so for me, the idea of people being of dignity and having worth really is the grounding of the start of property rights. And so I really start with the concept of self-ownership. And if you don't start with that concept, then things like slavery and other sorts of things are allowable. And so for me, the moral issues really are kind of foundational to the property rights issues, although there's a whole host of efficiency issues that also flow from that, aside from the moral issues.
Now, but from that, so this notion of self-ownership, how does that notion then inform your view about how we should think about the environment and free market environmentalism, which is something you've been associated with?
Right, and most of my work with free market environmentalism has been with PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, where I'm a senior fellow. And the PERC approach basically tries to, or thinks about, almost all environmental problems as property rights problems. They really come from the lack of definition and enforcement of property rights. Because what we think of as an environmental problem is usually a cost imposed upon somebody without their willing consent. What causes consent? It's ownership. What allows consent is ownership. And so if you look at environmental problems through the lens of property rights, it really lends a focus to it. And it also tells you how you might think about solutions to particular environmental problems. Think about ways of giving feedback loops, holding people responsible for that which they do, rewarding them for things that they do that advantage others, and penalizing them for things that harm others. And so a property rights regime then is both a way of giving feedback and giving incentives to get appropriate sorts of environmental care.
Now, I want to ask you about something and see if you've noticed this. You teach young people. I've seemed to detect a phenomenon of what I would call, at least among evangelicals, a sort of embracing of green values or
right.
An environmental ethic in recent years. I'm wondering if you've seen that and what your sense is of what might be driving some of that.
Well, I think that for a long time the evangelical church did ignore some of the environmental issues because there was a fair amount of what Christians would think of as kind of paganism at the root of some of the environmental issues. I think that's unfortunate because I think there's a good reason for creation care, for Christians to be deeply concerned about the environment. Unfortunately, from my perspective, some of the evangelical embrace of the environmental movement has done it without thinking very seriously about some of the consequences of embracing particular aspects of the environmental movement. And in some sense, you have to think about humans really the curse on the earth because of all the problems. There's part of the environmental movement that would hold that everything that's natural, that's good, except for humans, we're the unnatural part of the universe. Well, that's not a Christian position. A Christian position would say the creation is good and that humans created in the image of God are a good part of that creation. Now, we're fallen, we can do all sorts of bad things, but the solution to environmental problems is not just getting rid of people and returning to kind of a Rousseauian native state of nature where everything's perfect.
Okay, I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk to you about your lecture that you're going to be giving a little later tonight. You ask if we in the current context, if we should even be attempting a moral defense of market capitalism. And your answer is yes. Why is that?
One thing, from a realistic sort of a perspective, as you look around the world and you think about alternative ways of trying to get people to coordinate, trying to secure cooperation among people that don't know each other, market capitalism really still is our best bet. It's not flawless. There's certain problems with it. The last economic crisis certainly indicates there's problems with it. A lot of the problems with the current crisis, of course, are not just because of market capitalism, but because of unfortunate government intervention. But be that as it may, as you think about, well, is there a third way? I mean, it's pretty clear that centrally planned economies, socialism hasn't worked. So many people are looking kind of for this new way, this third way. And I really don't think there is one. I think that market capitalism, appropriately underlaid by a strong moral foundation, a civic culture, is the best that we can do. And it's not going to be a perfect world, but I'm willing to defend it as a moral system, as a system that meets certain prerequisites for moral life. And it certainly allows more of an opportunity for human flourishing for people to choose the moral life than alternative systems do.
Right, that actually gets to my next question, because the argument that you hear a lot, even from people who might be skeptical about markets, is that, well, it delivers the goods, right? So it's efficient, so we can get goods and services that we want when we want them. But you're going beyond that a little bit, or that's not your primary justification. You mentioned human flourishing. Could you just talk a little bit more about your views on this aspect of it? Because I think it's one of the possibly the less appreciated aspects of what a market system does or is capable of doing.
Many defenses of markets really start with the material goods. You know, markets produce a lot. Well, I think that's important, and the reduction of poverty is clearly a moral good. But human flourishing, the ability to act in a moral manner, is very crucial, and part of that means that we have to have the freedom to act upon how we want to order the world. But there have to be some sorts of limits on that. And one of the arguments that I make is that market capitalism is both a system of opportunity but a system of boundaries. And the boundaries actually come through private property rights. If you look at a historical perspective, what private property rights mean is that the rich, the powerful, the elite are constrained much more in terms of what they can do to the powerless and the marginalized and the people that are kind of outside or at the fringes of the system than alternatives. There's kind of this utopian idea that if we get rid of private property, basically the powerless are going to gain power. I actually see the opposite, that private property is just fundamental to the protection of the rights and the opportunity to flourish of the people who don't have the ordinary sorts of opportunities.
Well, P.J. Hill, thank you so much for joining us. For American Conversations, I'm Nick Schulz.
Thank you.